I began to rationalize in my head, and the primal spasms of fear began to die down, comforted by warm concrete logic. There was nothing to fear. I had nothing to fear. I needed something to calm my nerves. We weren't allowed alcohol aboard the station, of course, but I was pretty sure there were some anxiety pills in the medicine cabinet. Pills. It was always pills. They were in another white bottle, marked with black text. They tasted like chalk, no artificial mint this time. As I felt the large lump slide down my throat, my heart rate began to slow. Maybe half an hour passed before I began to really feel the effects. I could sense my heart beating heavily and slowly in my chest, each thump further away from the last, but heavier, the mass of muscle and veins starting to release itself from the confines of my fleshy body. Time was slowing down. As I watched the sun slowly creep up across the side of the earth, the names of all the pills and tablets I had been taking began to run through my head. Aminoglutaric acid, Atenol, Decorus, Grandaxin, Olatetrine. The list stretched on and on. The names didn't mean anything, just odd foreign words that were a problem to pronounce, and an even bigger problem to spell. There was a small bead of sweat forming on my forehead. I could feel it just above my left eye. It wavered lightly, and I'm sure it rippled each time my heart gave another thump. Nothing now but the sound of my heartbeat and the porthole in front of me. My vision began to focus inwards, the edges blurring out. I was very close to the glass now, despite the fact I hadn't moved an inch. My field of view was rapidly zooming in on the geometric curve of the earth as it was caressed by dark clouds. Everything else had passed out of my view, now just a stretched and blurred mass on the edges of my vision. I was through the glass, and now looking at the vast face of the earth as it turned seductively into the light of the sun, that great scorched ball of searing heat. My journey down was starting to speed up. Still slow at first. I barely surpassed the speed of Solid's orbit. But soon, my acceleration brought me up to greater speeds. The blue planet loomed up in front of me, and I was falling into its great yawning maw. The void whipped past me as my speed reached unimaginable levels. The atmosphere was beginning to glow around my vision, burning first yellow, then white hot. Clouds parted and the patchwork green of the country sped towards me seconds from impact. Jerking awake, I was pulled from my hallucination by the heavy beating of my heart. The pearl of sweat on my forehead had evaporated, leaving just a tiny white deposit of salt crystals. I was fine. I was still here. Just a slight dizziness remained from my hallucination. I needed a drink, I decided. I needed a drink and something to eat. My mouth felt like it was full of rock salt, and I really needed to wash that out. I grabbed a water bottle and started to drink the rubber-tinged water as I rooted through the cupboards and cabinets, trying to find some food that would be inoffensive to my stomach. Beef stew, it seemed, was the best choice. It came in a small tin that didn't require heating. Ripping off the lid of the can, a small blob of brown stew was dislodged from inside, and I watched it spiral away across the kitchen. It slammed into the side of one of the kitchen cabinets with a violent splat, leaving a dark brown smudge. Sitting at the flight console, I tried to run the diagnostic program. I wanted to find out what time the filter had blown out and why the alarm hadn't gone off. Lines of code flickered down the screen, repeating over and over again as I tried to connect with the diagnostic system. I could hear the memory disks whirling loudly as they strained to figure out what the sensors were doing. The computer insisted nothing was wrong. No alarms had been reported, no problems detected. Nothing. It was as if nothing had happened. The diagnostic finished and flashed up the results. 0 errors found. I slammed the side of the screen with my fist, and it flickered, before I tore myself out of the console chair and headed back to the living area. I was starting to get jittery. The air was cold, or at least it felt like it. The whole incident had given me an uncomfortable feeling about the station, and the cocktail of pills didn't help. My skin crawled just thinking about it. The small noises, the beeps and thumps, the hiss of air pumps and the groan of metal. I noticed every single one now. Goosebumps rippled across my skin every time I heard something even slightly out of place. I was a wreck by the time 2 hours had passed. The cumulative sum of every single tiny rattle or creak had set my teeth grating and shredded my nerves. I was totally prepared for the station to start plummeting back towards the earth at any second. Every time the filter system gave a hiss, I was convinced a leak had sprung, and I was going to be sucked out into the cold vacuum of space, through a hole the size of my nostril, squeezed into a fine red paste as I was spit out across the atmosphere, my liquidized entrails slowly spiraling across the cloudy skies. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to put myself out of my misery, at least temporarily. Sleep would be ignorance of any problem, and ignorance, I told myself, was bliss. I repeated this mantra over and over as I pulled the pills from the medical cabinet and downed 2 without a hesitation, followed by a quick sip from my water bottle. Ignorance was bliss. Blackness clawed at the edge of my vision as I climbed into the sleeping bag. The pills were beginning to take effect. I closed my eyes and was ferried away from that ticking metal coffin in the sky. I didn't dream, of course. I never dreamt up there. But I enjoyed a few hours of comfortable blackness. When I awoke, the pill bottle was still clutched in my hand. I had it pressed up against my chest in the warm confines of my sleeping bag. There was a slight buzzing coming from the strip of light on the roof I had never noticed before. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just disquieting, especially having only just woken up. I studied it carefully until my retinas were scorched blue by the bright glow. I closed my eyes and tried to shake off its imprint on the back of my eyes. Sweat caked itself on my body, as it always did when I woke up, and I couldn't wait to get the sleeping garment off and have a shower. It was always too warm in the sleeping bag. From outside the small box in my compartment, I heard a noise. An echoing thump. Just a thermal ping, I told myself. Just the metal expanding and contracting outside. Nothing more. Still, I was frozen in my place, listening out for any other noise despite telling myself there was nothing to fear. Then came another thump, another deep, echoing thump. Color must have drained from my face, because my entire body went cold when I heard it. I almost felt the blood being squeezed from my veins. I began to squirm in my sleeping bag, trying to free my arms so I could tear off the restraints that stopped me from floating around the compartment while I slept. I was aching to get out, the noises outside making me suddenly very uncomfortable. Then came the third thump. This couldn't be just a fluke. This couldn't just be heat expansions. I stopped thrashing for a second and listened. There it was again. It was regular, some kind of repetitive banging sound. It was coming from the opposite side of the station near the flight deck. The next one, however, sounded slightly closer, and the one after that, more so. The gaps between the bangs began to decrease, getting closer each time. They were footsteps. I was still strapped into the sleeping bag when I came to this realization, and whatever chills had run across my body before now paled in comparison to this. It was like I had been dropped from my warm sleeping compartment to the dark wastes of Siberia, spinning madly as I fell. Fear and a light-headed dizziness consumed me. The footsteps were getting closer. I heard a slight pause as they reached the small step where the flight deck transitioned into the living area. Shivers racked my body as I fumbled with the straps, trying to get out before whatever was the source of the footsteps reached me. My mind reeled, unable to think over the pounding of the footsteps. This couldn't be real. This could not be real. The straps came loose and I wriggled out of the bag, the footsteps shaking the whole station as they got closer. Great, crashing impacts just feet away now. I was sobbing as I went to the door handle, pressing it shut in a vain attempt to keep whatever was out there from getting in. There was one final step as the source of the sound came face to face with the door of my sleeping compartment. Then silence. I could hear my heavy breathing as I pressed my ear up to the plastic of the door, listening for whatever was out there. Nothing. Just silence. Something heavy slammed into the door and I jumped back in terror, slamming my head and body against the back wall. The impact echoed away and the station fell into silence once more. Several minutes passed before I got the courage to move. Not a single sound had disturbed the silence up to that point, and I had been forced to listen in terror to the sound of my desperate, shallow breaths. Gingerly, I clasped the handle and listened. Still nothing. Everything sounded calm out there. With one movement, I swallowed and threw open the sliding door. I winced at the squeak of its rollers. The station expanded before me, seemingly huge, dark, and empty. The whole space was stationary and quiet, nothing out there. I remained still for a few seconds, watching like a nervous gazelle at a watering hole, wary of predator stalking in the long grass. Slowly, I pulled myself out. I felt like I was being riddled with the eyes of hundreds, all watching me. My skin suddenly felt very vulnerable. Whatever was out here, it scared me beyond what I thought was possible. It showed me the cracks in my facade. Slowly, I began to move towards the kitchen, running my eyes over every surface. My body was weak and shaking. The air was warm and still, and I began to steady my breathing. I kept darting my eyes around, though, convinced something was waiting for me, just out of my field of view. "I think there's someone here," I hissed into the radio, looking over my shoulder as I did. "Soyuz, do you read? I think there's someone here." The response that came through the speakers was crackling and garbled, pierced occasionally by harsh electronic tones or the buzz of static, but it was recognizable. It was Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, number 1 in B-flat minor. I recognized it from a long time ago, from a different time. No words, just music. "Soyuz 2-1, do you read?" I repeated as the music stopped and the transmission faded away. "Commander, answer me!" There was nothing except another quick burst of the music again. It lasted a few seconds before stopping. Leaning down, I examined the dial, and sure enough, I was on the correct frequency. "Please!" I begged, tears welling up in my eyes out of fear. The fear of my only lifeline to the outside world down there being severed. Nothing, except the music. It didn't stop this time. It carried on. It lasted a good minute before the song reached its conclusion, and I was once again left in shocked silence. With a numbness in my heart, I placed the mouthpiece back down on its stand and pulled myself from the chair. I was alone up here, or maybe I wasn't, and whoever else was there and myself were just alone together. It made no sense. How could someone else be up here? How could there be someone on the station without me knowing? There was nowhere to hide. I saw every inch of the pressurized space of the ship every single day. Then it struck me. There was one place I didn't go. Flight Engineer Zolobov's sleeping compartment. It had been undisturbed since the day he had left. I turned around to face it, looking at the door with a new, surging intensity that I hadn't been capable of before. It was locked when I tried it. I couldn't remember whether it had been me or Zolobov who had locked it that day, although I was certain I didn't know where the key was. I didn't even know if it was still on the station. The keyhole was tiny, not wide enough to look through, and even if it had been, it would have been too dark on the other side to see anything. I had to find a way to open it. The kitchen was my first stop. I found the knife. It was a metal blade with a flat plastic handle, about 8 inches long, and it glinted alluringly in the powerful station lights. I pulled off the plastic sheath that covered the blade and headed for the door. With all my curiosity, all my fear, I pounded the knife into the door. The blade sank in maybe an inch before I pulled it out again and gave another powerful stab at the plastic. This time, the blade slid in better, all the way up to the handle, and when I pulled it out, light flooded into the darkened compartment. Slipping my hand around the doorframe to keep myself in place, I gave a mighty kick, and the plastic cracked and splintered. It was only about 1/3 of an inch thick, so my bare foot went through the hole my knife had wrought pretty easily, collecting several plastic splinters as it went. After withdrawing my now stinging foot and pulling out the splinters, I tore open the door, which hung off its rail loosely. The inside of the compartment was a dark coffin, nearly identical to mine. It smelt terrible, though, of dried blood and sweat and other biological things. I guess the blood, which was now a rust-colored stain on the sleeping bag which hung on one wall, had come from the night Zolobov had spent in here, while we waited for the Soyuz to evacuate him. I had bandaged his hand pretty badly, and it had leaked a dark crimson and translucent yellow fluid all night. He had been in such pain, I could hear him from outside the compartment, whispering to himself and occasionally sobbing. I had been the one who had been tasked with the gruesome endeavor of scraping his fingers off the inside of the airlock hatch. All this came back to me as I hung nervously in the entrance of his compartment. I flicked on the light, and it spilled an appealing orange glow across the scene with a cheery buzz. The first thing I noticed were the pill bottles. There were at least 10 floating around the floor, their shiny labels reflecting the light. I picked one up and looked at it. General painkillers. I gave a low whistle. There were enough painkillers here to make an elephant numb. Or there would have been if the bottles hadn't all been empty. Had Zolobov been taking them? Was he an addict? Another possibility formed itself in my mind. Had he taken them all in one go? Had he been preparing himself for an accident? Had he deliberately sliced off his own fingers? With the amount of painkillers here, he wouldn't have felt a thing, as that hatch had come down on his hand. I began to root around, worried about what else I would find. The stench of body odor was strong. I guess it had been fermenting in here for a while. Then I found the notebook. It was wrapped in brown paper, and when I found it, I was a little confused. It was small, about the size of my palm, and had a black cover. Flipping it open to a random page, I found that it was in Zolobov's distinctive scrawl he called handwriting. It read, July 17th. Boris woke up at 5:45 ALMT. Took shower for 12 minutes at 5:49 ALMT. When finished, shaved for approximately 5 minutes. Missed several spots. Left shower compartment 605 ALMT. Headed to living area. Drank approximately 200 milliliters of water, ate breakfast. And so it continued. I felt sick. This was about me. This was a detailed record of my activities that day, right down to accounts of our conversations. I flipped to the next page, and sure enough, there was a description of my activities on July 18th. It was written in eye-watering detail, from the amount of time I spent on the toilet to how I ate and drank. It was almost clinical. Going through the book, there was an entry for each day since we had launched, right up to the 3 days before the accident. I could feel a lump in my throat, all sympathy I had held for my flight engineer rapidly draining away. Whatever this was, it was disgusting and invasive. Slowly and coldly, I wrapped the notebook back in the paper, placed it back down on the shelf, and backed out into the living area. Whatever was happening here, Zolobov had been in on it. Why had he stopped was the real question. Surely giving up just 2 days before the accident couldn't be a coincidence. Ops 3, do you read? Please confirm, Ops 3. The radio was barking behind me. I ignored it, still staring at the compartment, my jaw slack. How long had it been going like that? I didn't know. Still, I didn't rush to answer Commander Zudov's transmission. I moved slowly, without a definite purpose, keeping my eyes fixed on the sleeping compartment. What the fuck? I swore loudly into the mouthpiece. Where have you been? Say again, Ops 3. I do not understand. Why have you been ignoring my transmission, Soyuz? Rage bubbled through my voice, but I tried to keep it even for the sake of anyone back on Earth who may have been listening. Ops 3? We have received no transmission from you since yesterday? That's a lie. You were sending out that music. Listen, Ops 3, I've talked to Flight Engineer Raj Davinsky. We're both very worried about you. We think perhaps you're having some kind of breakdown. Breakdown? I murmured slowly. No, I'm not having... It's perfectly understandable in your position, Boris. Perfectly normal, Zudov purred, his voice slow and gentle. Nobody blames you. All the stress you've been put under. A breakdown, I repeated once again. Was it possible? Could I be going insane? Yes, you've been up there alone so long. You started to imagine things, started to see things. Are you sure? Perhaps we should come early, Boris. Perhaps we should come and help you. Something in Zudov's voice hinted at a hidden meaning to his words, no longer hidden by his forced friendliness, a pretense he once clearly strained to keep up. It sent chills down my spine. No, that won't be necessary. I think it will, Boris. I think we'll have to set a course for Salyut 5 right now. No! I don't want to disrupt the mission. I gave a nervous chuckle. The mission, that's what's important. Zudov was silent for a second, considering my comments. The station was filled with the sound of static. I prayed he would agree to stay away for another 2 days. There was something about Zudov, something I only just noticed, that scared me, and the more time I spent away from him, the better. Yes, of course you can manage 2 days. You should get some sleep, though. Take the sleeping pills. You sound tired. I'll do that. See you in 2 days, then. Get some sleep, Boris. We'll be here before you know it. How long had he been referring to me by first name? That was against protocol. Everything's going to be fine. I placed the mouthpiece back on the clip and swallowed nervously. 2 days, stuck up here. I was now unsure which option was worse. Being trapped up here? or being trapped on the Soyuz with a smooth-talking Zudov. I mulled over what he said. It seemed entirely possible to me that I was having a breakdown. The things I'd seen, the things I'd heard, those couldn't be real. They couldn't be. Footsteps weren't possible in microgravity. That's what I told myself. But the implication of everything being just a hallucination was equally sinister. Was I going insane? Everything had seemed so real when they had been happening. The notebook had felt real. The footsteps couldn't have just been in my imagination, could they? And the carbon filter, had that really come loose from its piping at all? It would explain why the computer never detected any faults. They had all been in my head. There was one cast-iron way to prove all this, of course. I could go to Zolobov's compartment. I could unwrap the brown paper, and I could look at the notebook. If it wasn't a paranoia-fueled hallucination, all the writing would still be there. If it was all just in my head, all the writing would be gone. Or even better, the notebook wouldn't be there at all. Of course, it's never that simple. I tore open the brown paper, and there it was, with a feeling of nausea. I opened the first page, and confirmed the writing was still there. My stomach sank. With a burst of rage, I threw the book across the room. It slammed against the far wall, then fluttered away. There was nothing I could do then. It had been there, in my hands, solid and real, which meant I was left with two options. Either I hadn't been hallucinating, and the book was real, or I was further down the rabbit hole of my own head than I thought. Both of the possibilities were, unfortunately, terrifying. I needed some time, I decided, to figure out what to do. I needed to get things straight in my head. I'd had to do something about this. I couldn't be paralyzed by inaction any longer. I couldn't take it. Slowly, I crossed back to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I pulled my body through the air. All the while my head pounded, heavy with the throb of blood. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Then I remembered. The pills. Zudov had told me to take the pills. Perhaps I was tired. Zudov had never lied to me before, I noted. He wouldn't say anything that could put me in harm's way, surely. Commander Zudov had my best interests at heart. It was no use. I couldn't fool myself with bullshit excuses about best interests. I knew I didn't trust that man anymore. Not for another velvet syllable that was wrought by his distant throat, nor for another instruction echoed across the void. I was done listening to him. Internal debate finished, I steadied my breathing and decided to look at my problem logically. I tried to block out the memories of the footsteps in the book and the filter and just look at it from an objective point of view. That was pretty much all I could do at this point. I could take the pills, or I could sit here in terror and confusion for 2 days. I knew, like it or not, that I would have to take the pills at some point. I couldn't stay awake for another 2 days, yet I couldn't sleep. I knew that natural sleep would be an impossibility after everything that had happened to me. So I took the pills. I washed them down with a sip of water and soon felt myself drifting on an ocean of sticky black tar. It took all my effort to simply pull myself back to my sleeping compartment and climb into the sleeping bag before I sank into the vicious black liquid of my mind and felt it soak into my skin and fill my lungs. Once again, the night passed without dreams. I was awoken once again by the hum of the strip light. It had all the stirrings of some horrible déjà vu with me. It gnawed at the pit of my stomach, all the knowledge, all the memories, and all the fear that it might happen again. There was something else there, though. The knowledge that possibly I might not be alone up here. Something was clearly very wrong, I reflected, and my policy of ignorance had failed so badly up to this point that I was nearly sick. I needed to confront it. I needed to find whatever truth lay behind the events here. I climbed out of the sleeping compartment and looked around. It took me a second or two to see the writing. When I did, however, my heart stopped. It was everywhere, all across the walls, large and black. It had been smeared in some black substance using the end of a thumb. Christ! I shuddered at the sight of it, seeing something wholly unnatural and wholly unknown. It was an ugly confirmation of something that had lurked within me for days. It had been easy to be unafraid of the unknown, when the unknown had been crammed in a safe in the back of my mind. But now, with the unknown on full view in front of me in all its horrific glory, it was impossible to deny my terror. The words didn't mean anything. No. It was their very existence which scared me. They were just numbers or random phrases, but the fact that they actually were there. It couldn't be real, I decided. It could not be real. Slowly, I turned around and climbed back into my sleeping compartment. I slid the door closed again and took a deep breath. This was just in my head. It wasn't real. I was just imagining. The things in my head were spilling out onto the walls of the station. When I opened the door, it would be gone, I decided. The writing would be gone. It was in my mind, and I was in control of my mind. I was in control. With another deep breath, I slid open the door and looked out, praying it would be gone. It was gone. The walls were bare. It had all been in my head. What was wrong with me? Slowly, dragging my eyes over every surface for any trace of the black markings, I pulled myself towards the flight deck and the radio transmitter. I couldn't do it any longer. I had to call Soyuz. I had to get off. If I didn't, I feared the damage would be irreparable, and I would be trapped in a semi-real world of my own hallucinations forever. When I flicked on the radio transmitter, however, something was already being transmitted on the other side. The green lights flickered in confirmation that the set was powered up, and as soon as it did, I tore up the mouthpiece. Before I could speak, however, a harsh voice jumped from the speakers. Having visual and auditory hallucinations, along with paranoia and a loss of appetite. It was Zudov. His voice relaxed me. Despite my misgivings for him, I knew that it was the same man I had been talking to all this time. His words, on the other hand, were troubling to say the least. They clearly weren't directed at me. Who was he talking to? They hadn't informed me that communication with ground had been resumed, and I told the commander specifically to do that. Keep observing him. Another voice now. Not Zudov, and not Rodchivensky. If they were the only two people on Soyuz 2-1, then Zudov must be talking to someone elsewhere. Someone on the ground. There was a hiss of static, and the channel broke up into meaningless beeping. I listened in anger. I needed to know who they had been talking about, although I had a sinking feeling I already knew. Air is contaminated? The channel was back, and the other was still speaking. Contaminated? I didn't quite catch the first half of the sentence through the interference, but that word alone was enough to spook me. Yes, concentration is up to 21%. Carry on observing, Soyuz. Nothing more. There was a hiss, and the stranger went silent. The air went dead. I swallowed. The noise sounded deafening in the new silence. What had I just heard? Who had they been talking about? The obvious answer was just on the tip of my tongue, but I dared not to say it. I didn't even dare to think it. It was too dangerous, too terrifying to comprehend. I looked down at the radio set and saw something chilling. The frequency dial had been changed. It certainly wasn't me who changed it, I was sure of that. That meant that someone or something else was here. That meant it was all real. I closed my eyes and turned the dial back to the familiar position. The warm hiss of static greeted me, different in tone to that on the other channel. I had to know. I had to know who they were talking about. I had to know whether I was alone up here. I had to know if I was losing my mind. Soyuz 2-1? Come in, Soyuz 2-1, I asked eventually, eyes still firmly shut. Reading Ops 3. Reading loud and clear. Soyuz, I began, then stopped and took a deep breath. Soyuz, have you had any communication with ground yet? There was a short, heavy pause before Commander Zudov spoke. When he did, I could tell by the tone of his voice there was a sickening smile on his lips. None whatsoever, I'm afraid, Salyut. Still out because of these solar flares. That was it. The big lie. The tipping point. As soon as those words reached me, I nearly broke down into despair. A little sob escaped my mouth. The man I had trusted all this time, had everything been lies? Ops 3, do you copy? He asked eventually, and I tried to bring myself to respond. Am I alone up here, Commander? My voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the interference. Alone? What do you mean? I mean, is there someone else on the station? There's no one up there, only you. You're saying it's all in my head? You're saying I've lost my mind? Of course not. You're just under a lot of stress, all alone up there. It's no surprise you began to see things, hear things. It was only to be expected from someone in your conditions. I know I'm not crazy. Of course you're not crazy, he purred gently, his voice warm and reassuring. I was almost lulled back into trusting the man again. You're just tired. You've worked hard, but don't worry. Your mission is nearly over. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, I repeated numbly. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't in my mind. That man, that voice, was lying to me. It had to be real, but what could I do? He would be here in less than a day, and after that, things would be far out of my hands. I tore open every cupboard, looked through every compartment, scoured every inch of the plain white metal. I searched for any slight inclination there might be a concealed compartment somewhere else in the station. I looked for anything that could prove me right. There was nothing. I don't know how much time passed in my search, but soon I realized looking was a fool's errand. There was nothing to find. What if it isn't human? I spoke out loud to my own shock. I never talked to myself. My voice was small and insignificant, even in the cramped air of the station. But the idea haunted me. I had never believed in the paranormal, but my heart beat faster just thinking about it. There was clearly an entity of some kind up here, and if it wasn't a man... Then came the rasping, a deep, wet hiss from inside the walls. It was followed by another, this one sounding more like a gasp. I froze as I listened. The regular inhaling and exhaling of air. Something was breathing. Something inside the walls. Commander? I whispered over the radio. jerking my head around as I heard another breath. It was only just audible when I was at the radio set. It seemed to emanate from the living area bulkhead. I can hear it breathe. Breathe? The response was swift, and surprisingly from Zudov. Nervous. I can hear it breathing inside the walls. It's awake. I held out the mouthpiece and pressed down the transmit button, hoping he would hear it. That's just the ventilator system, he decided doubtfully after I had finished. You must have ruptured a tube. I'll take a look when we get there. I let go of the mouthpiece and tried to steady my own breathing, but the great deep breathing coming from the living area distracted me from my rhythm. It couldn't just be a torn air pipe. It had to be something more. Slowly, I pulled myself up and began to head down, gingerly, towards the source of the noise. The knife was still in the kitchen drawer, so I withdrew it and swung around to face the noise. It was coming from a maintenance panel. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear what was within. The metal was cold against my skin. There was a loud bang from within, and I jerked my head back instantly in terror. It was followed by a desperate scratching, fingernails on metal. I pushed myself backwards and crashed into the wall behind me. The scratching must have gone on for hours as I sat there in sheer terror, knife raised in front of me. Eventually, it began to slow, and then it stopped. Just silence remained. I slowly unfurled. I couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't. Ops 3, come in. We are beginning our approach. I swore loudly and viciously, tears running off my face. Not him. Not now. I was stuck between whatever horror was on this station and whatever horror was off of it. Fuck you, Zudov! I snatched the mouthpiece and yelled down it in pure fear. Say again, Ops 3? He sounded indignant. Stay away from me, I warned, my voice shaky. All the while the hairs on the back of my neck were beginning to stand upright. Don't bring that ship anywhere near here. These are my orders, Commander. I have a knife, I threatened, knowing my options were running out. He had forced my hand. There was silence for a second. Time passed by like thick black tar. Is that a threat? Zudov was cold in his outrage, but I could hear strains of pure ferocity in his voice. Did you just threaten me? Stay away from me, I sobbed once again. Please! I'm so sorry, he decided on eventually, and the frequency went dead. I could see the black dot of the Soyuz capsule on the horizon of the Earth, silhouetted in the front of the glowing blue. I had maybe half an hour before he got here. It wasn't enough. I couldn't think anymore. The thing in the walls was still silent, as far as I could tell. With a beating heart, I turned back to the maintenance panel where the noise had been coming from. I nearly jumped out of my skin when it gave a screech, followed by another. It was the sound of nails on a chalkboard or something like that. Staring at the panel, I saw a sight I will never forget. The screech was coming from a screw. It was turning in its socket, giving a mighty squeal each time it did. There was a clink as the screw finished its last rotation, floated gently away from its holding. Whatever was turning the screws moved on to the second. I backed up slowly and clutched my knife so hard my knuckles were white. My tears streamed across my face, leaving salty deposits on my eyelids. I gritted my teeth. It felt like the contents of my stomach were about to rush up my throat. It was heavy and nauseating. Another sob racked my quivering body. I crawled into the airlock hatch entrance, right next to Zolobov's dried blood. I ran my fingers over the stain and closed my eyes. In my head, I tried to drown out the sounds with desperate prayers, but it wasn't enough. There was a heavy clunk as I felt Soyuz's impact. Cracking open one eye, I looked back at the station. Floating in the air was the now detached maintenance compartment panel, along with a handful of screws. I heard movement from within. Turning my focus back to Soyuz, I banged on the airlock door, then felt the hiss as the seals began to fill. This was it. The hairs on the back of my neck were pricking up again. I had to get out. I had to get out now. The airlock hatch hissed and swung open. My eyes fell into Soyuz's capsule, into the tiny space where the two astronauts would be, where the man I had been talking to for the last week would be sitting. The capsule was empty. Thank you for tuning in. If you like this story, hit that like button. Consider sharing and subscribing to the channel to be alerted to new uploads. If you'd like to see something specific on my channel, leave a comment below and I will look into it. Good night, everyone.